All right, everybody, we're on to part 2 of our discussion of chaining. Let's talk about how we can apply chaining. Okay, there are 3 main ways that we can apply a chaining procedure, or we can train people using a chaining procedure. There's backward chaining, where we teach the last stimulus and response pair first. So the last component in a sequence will be taught first. So if we were teaching someone how to throw darts, we would begin with the actual throwing of the dart into the dartboard. That will be the first component we teach, and we'll work backwards from there. Where to stand, how to hold the dart, where to get the dart from will all happen after. Forward chaining is teaching the first stimulus response pairing first. So in the example of dart throwing, we would begin with showing them where to pick up a dart, for example. So we would start with the first, teach the second, and then so on. So backward starts with the last behavior and moves from there, and forward starts with the first behavior and the first stimulus and response pairing, moves on from there forward. Okay, so here's the general idea for how chaining training should work. First, you would present the stimulus, the first discriminative stimulus. So with our dart throwing example, we might, place the dart in our subject's hand and say, okay, here is the situation. You've got the dart in your hand and you're ready to throw. You then might present a prompt. This could be verbal or physical. So you might say, go ahead and throw the dart. Make sure you keep your wrist locked in this way. Keep it parallel to the ground until you release it, right? You might give some verbal information. You'd also provide a physical prompt. You might approach the subject and physically move their arm. Okay, move your arm like this when you throw it, right? Provide praise or possibly other reinforcers for the correct response. So after the subject correctly tosses the dart, you might say, great job, you did it. Encourage them, right? Provide a reinforcer. Gradually, you want to fade the prompts or use prompt delay. So once the person has thrown the dart correctly, the next time you might try to give them less instruction. You might just say something like, okay, go ahead. Or remember to keep your wrist in the right position, and sort of decrease the amount of information you're giving and prompting until the subject is performing the response without prompting. You can also use prompt delay, so be ready to give them a prompt, but don't do it right away. Give them some time to try it on. When the response occurs without prompts, move on to the next SR component. So let's say we're doing backward chaining with dart throwing response, right? So after the subject has thrown the dart successfully once, you move to the next SR component, which might be learning to stand in the right place. So you would hand them a dart and say, okay, go ahead and get ready to throw. And let them walk over to the right place to do so, and maybe prompt them a little bit, say, okay, go stand in front of the dotted line there. And when they do that, you say, great, good job, go ahead. And then they can move on to the next part of the chain. Basically, we repeat steps 1 through 5 until the chain is replied reliably and independently. So moving through the SR components in order until the entire behavioral chain is established. Okay, so here's what a behavioral chain would look like in that example. We have our first stimulus, which is a dart rack. So discriminative stimulus 1 is a bunch of darts. The appropriate response here, response 1, would be to grab a dart. Our stimulus number 2 is the tape line on the floor. And the appropriate behavior would be to approach and stand behind that line, which is response. Our discriminative stimulus number 3 would be in position, right? So you have the stimulus of standing behind the line, looking at the dartboard in front of you, having the dart in your hand in the right position, and being ready to throw. The response to be performed at this stage would be response number 3, throw the dart. Throwing the dart would then, make contact with the target if this has been done correctly, which will then produce reinforcement, right? You might, so our stimulating reinforcement might be something like a verbal affirmation or a high five or whatever, saying, hey, great job throwing that dart, you nailed it. Ideally, we would fade this reinforcing stimulus quickly after the behavior has been established, especially if we want that behavior to become sort of naturally reinforcing. If we want this person to enjoy a leisure hobby like throwing darts for the dart throwing sake, we want to stop providing this external reinforcement and allow the behavior chain to be sustained by the natural reinforcement of performing the activity. So learning the steps in this order would be a forward chaining procedure, right? Where we're starting with the beginning of the chain. So we're starting with the first step, grabbing a dart from the rack, moving over the line, getting ready to throw, and then throwing. That's the order these behaviors will be performed in naturally when you're performing this itself. So an advantage of that is it might be easier to learn because it's sort of the natural progression. But a drawback might be that there's no natural reinforcement from it. If you're stuck at the stage of learning where to stand or how to hold the thing, then you're not really enjoying the task, and it might be harder to motivate continued behavior. It might rely more on praise-based reinforcers or shadowing the behavior, so physically helping the person to do it. So that might rely more on those sort of things, which we want to fade as quickly as possible when we move on to the next step. So under some conditions, it might be simpler and more effective to employ a backward chaining procedure where you begin with the final stimulus response pair and work backwards. So in our dart example, this is how that might look. We might position our subject behind the line, hand them a dart, instruct them on how to hold it, help them with that, maybe physically or verbally prompt them to get there. So say something like, maintain your 3-finger grip on the dart and release, once you've passed the 45-degree point on your throw. I don't know if that's real dart advice. I'm not really a dart pro. Or if they're having a lot of difficulty, you might say something like, here, let me guide you, and sort of stand behind them and help them move their arm to perform the behavior. After they perform that behavior, you might reinforce it and say something like, great work, as they throw the dart, and provide reinforcement for successfully completing the task. That might be the first stage we do, right? So we start with the final bit of behavior in the chain and then work backwards. Again, this puts us really close in the chain in terms of connecting the behavior to a more profound reinforcer, which might help with motivation. After that sequence has been established, the sort of final stimulus response pairing, we might move back a step in the procedure, right? And guide them to the tape line and say, okay, make sure you stand behind the line. They already know how to hold the dart and throw it, so we just have to instruct them on how to get to this spot. And after they get to the right spot, you might provide some verbal reinforcement and say, great job, keep going. Then they'll perform that response, right? Stand behind the line, and then they'll move on to the part of the chain they already know. We should not need to do prompting at this point, right? If we have done this successfully, we should be able to fade the prompt here and allow them to perform this behavior on their own, producing the natural reinforcer of a job well done with this dart throwing. And we would continue with this until we reach the first behavior in the sequence. In this example, picking a dart up from the board and performing it in sequence. So with both forward and backward chaining, we're training the same goal, which is chaining a bunch of behaviors together. So chaining a series of stimuli, the appropriate response to generate the next stimuli, and so on. The only difference between forward and backward chaining is the order that we're training the steps in. So the final approach we have for training on chaining procedures is total task presentation. This is what it sounds like. It's like the others, except that we execute the whole behavioral chain in each training trial. So you can imagine if, in the backward chaining procedure, we're starting with just the final step, the final stimulus response pairing. With total task, we would have them execute the entire behavioral chain every time. So this example, going all the way from picking up the dart to throwing it with instruction, the entire chain every time. That's total task presentation. So in this procedure, you would use graduated guidance in each trial. So initially, we might be very heavy-handed with our prompting or shadowing. So we might physically prompt or verbally prompt the individual to perform the behavior, sort of help them through it. After that, we can fade to sort of shadowing. So if you can imagine, we're helping this person physically move their arm on the way to throw the dart. Shadowing would be just sort of not controlling their movements anymore, but keeping your hand close and sort of making sure they're moving in the right direction. And as soon as they seem to get it, you would want to fade that shadowing behavior. Again, as soon as some independence is displayed with the behavior, we want to fade the guidance and let them do it on their own. So to put it into the context of our example, we might begin by physically guiding the subject or verbally, very strongly guiding the subject, and then backing off when the subject moves correctly. We would fade to shadowing, so moving with the subject but not controlling their movement, and then eventually fade that shadowing so they're doing it on their own. We could use prompts and shadowing as needed, but remembering to fade those as soon as possible to avoid fostering dependence. So when we're applying chaining, there's a couple of things we need to think about, as with all of these behavioral procedures. One, is chaining the right procedure? Is this the thing we want to employ? Is this learning a new behavior, which is what chaining is suitable for, versus non-compliance? Do they know it, but they're just not complying with it? So likewise, is this a can't do or is it a won't do problem? You can't shape someone, an individual, to do something if they are incapable of doing it, right? If it's a behavior that is something they cannot perform at this time, then it's not something we can shape them to do if they're incapable of performing that behavior. Or is it a won't do problem? Is it a problem with the reinforcement schedule or their motivation? Perhaps we can chain someone to do a task that they are not currently willing to do, but that they are capable of performing. So the first thing that we need to do after we've decided that chaining is the procedure we want to employ is to develop a task analysis of the SR chain. We want to thoroughly examine the chain, and with the sort of painful scientific precision that we've talked about at so many points in this class, develop a task analysis. Identify every stimulus and every response that must be performed to each stimulus in order to produce the next stimulus in the chain. You should develop the task analysis with the audience in mind, right? How much do you need to break down each bit? Can you lump some things together? For example, our computer using example, is this person very good with computers? Do they already understand every step necessary between turning on the computer to getting onto a Zoom call? In which case you might just be able to make that step in the chain connect to the Zoom call. But if you're working with maybe an elderly relative that's not so good with computers, you might have to break down that chain into more steps. We need to collect some baseline data on how well they can perform the task before chaining training, or else we won't have a basis for comparison to see how effective our chaining procedure has been. We then need to choose the chaining procedure, meaning do we want to forward, backward, or total task presentation? And then implement it, right? Start the chaining training procedure. Continue to collect data during this process so we have a basis for improvement and comparison for when the training has completed. Ideally, we would then shift to intermittent reinforcement for maintenance. So while initially we might provide a lot of verbal praise or tokens from a token economy for successful completion of our behavioral chain, we don't want to rely on that forever. That's not really something we can do. So we could switch to intermittent reinforcement, so the behavior is being reinforced sporadically. Or if we're lucky, if the behavior we are trying to chain, it could perhaps become a natural reinforcer, right? Perhaps if the behavioral chain results in something desirable, like eating or having gained more independence, or enjoying a new leisure activity with our darts example, artificial reinforcement wouldn't be necessary, and it will sort of maintain itself. It's worth mentioning there are also other chaining procedures that we can employ that might be more suitable or easier. We could have picture prompts, like with this WikiHow article on how to throw a dart. We might be able to follow a picture prompts as a sort of chaining procedure. Just like when you get a bunch of IKEA furniture, you can follow picture prompts to assemble it. Perhaps a written task analysis. This is really common in a laboratory setting where you might have what we would call a standard operating procedure, which is a detailed sort of task analysis of the series of behaviors you need to perform in the lab to accomplish a task. And for your scientific audience, they can probably follow a written task analysis to perform that, so that could work just fine. There's also self-instructions. So self-instructions could be something basically that you could repeat to yourself while you're completing a task that would help you complete it successfully. So if you've ever remembered a combination to a locker, you might have self-instructions in your head. First 20, then 45, then 16, right? So you have, okay, first I turn it to 20, and then once I see that I'm at 20, I turn it until it's at 45. That's my next stimulus. When I see that, I turn it to 60 or 16, whatever I said. And that would be your third stimulus and third response. So you could repeat those instructions to yourself. Likewise, you might have a task you're repeating many times. If you're sorting things, you might say, okay, quarters go on the right and nickels go on the left, right? And every time you see a new coin, you might say, okay, quarters are right, nickels are left, right? Self-instructions, things you can use to prompt yourself when you see a stimulus to perform the correct response. Similar to picture prompts, we have video modeling. You might watch someone perform a chain of behaviors and model it from that. Okay, that's it for chaining. And that actually also concludes my contribution in terms of mini lectures for this course. Thanks for hanging in there. I really enjoyed this time with everybody. And don't be a stranger. I'll still be around. I'm still part of this class. I'm just going to be less involved from this point forward. So thanks again, and I'll see you around.